This is a continuation of The Risk Profession by Donald E. Westlake, comprising the second part and the end. There's only one way to handle a blunt old man. Be blunt right back. "I'll tell you how it is," I said. "The company isn't accusing you of anything, but it has to be sure everything's on the up and up before it pays out any 10,000 credits, and your partner just happening to fill out that cash return form just before he died. Well, you've got to admit it is a funny kind of coincidence." "How so?" He slurped coffee and glowered at me over the cup. "We made this strike here," he said. "We knew it was the big one. Jafe had that insurance policy of his, in case he never did make the big strike. As soon as we knew this was the big one, he said, 'I guess I don't need that retirement now,' and sat right down and wrote out the cash return. Then we opened a bottle of liquor and celebrated, and he got himself killed." The way Carpin said it, it sounded smooth and natural, too smooth and natural. "How did this accident happen anyway?" I asked him. "I'm not 100% sure of that myself," he said. "I was pretty well drunk myself by that time." But he put on his suit and said he was going out to paint the X. He was falling all over himself, and I tried to tell him it could wait till we'd had some sleep, but he wouldn't pay any attention to me. "So he went out," I said. He nodded. "He went out first. After a couple minutes, I got lonesome in here, so I suited up and went out after him. It happened just as I was going out the lock, and I just barely got a glimpse of what happened." He attacked the coffee again, noisily, and I prompted him, saying, "What did happen, Mr. Carpin?" "Well, he was capering around out there, waving the paint tube and such. There's a lot of sharp rocks sticking out around here. Just as I got outside, he lost his balance and kicked out, and scraped right into some of that rock and punctured his suit." "I thought the body was lost," I said, and he nodded. It was. The last thing in life Jafe ever did was try to shove himself away from those rocks. That, and the force of air coming out of that puncture for the first second or two, was enough to throw him up off the surface. It threw him up too high, and he never got back down. My doubt must have showed in my face, because he added, "Mister, there isn't enough gravity on this place to shoot craps with." He was right. As we talked, I kept finding myself holding unnecessarily tight to the arms of the chair. I kept having the feeling I was going to float out of the chair and hover around up at the top of the dome if I were to let go. It was silly, of course. There was some gravity on that planetoid after all, but I just don't seem to get used to low G. Nevertheless, I still had some more questions. "Didn't you try to get his body back? Couldn't you have reached him?" "I tried to, mister," he said. "Old Jafe McCann was my partner for 15 years, but I was drunk, and that's a fact. And I was afraid to go jumping up in the air for fear I'd go floating away too." "Frankly," I said, "I'm no expert on low gravity and asteroids, but wouldn't McCann's body just go into orbit around this rock? I mean, it wouldn't simply go floating off into space, would it?" "It sure would," he said. "There's a lot of other rocks out here too, mister, and a lot of them are bigger than this one and have a lot more gravity pull. I don't suppose there's a navigator in the business who could have computed Jafe's course in advance. He floated up and then he floated back over the dome here and seemed to hover for a couple minutes, and then he just floated out and away. His isn't the only body circling around the sun with all these rocks, you know." I chewed a lip and thought it all over. I didn't know enough about asteroid gravity or the conditions out here to be able to say for sure whether Carpin's story was true or not. Up to this point, I couldn't attack the problem on a fact basis. I had to depend on feeling now, the hunches and instincts of 8 years in this job, hearing some people tell lies and other people tell the truth. And my instinct said Ab Carpin was lying in his teeth. That dramatic little touch about McCann's body hovering over the dome before disappearing into the void. That sounded more like the embellishment of fiction than the circumstance of truth. And the string of coincidences were just too much. McCann just coincidentally happens to die right after he and his partner make their big strike. He happens to write out the cash return form just before dying, and his body just happens to float away, so nobody can look at it and check Carpen's story. But no matter what my instinct said, the story was smooth. It was smooth as glass, and there was no place for me to get a grip on it. What now? There wasn't any hole in Carpen's story, at least none that I could see. I had to break his story somehow, and in order to do that I had to do some nosing around on this planetoid. I couldn't know in advance what I was looking for. I could only look. I'd know it when I found it. It would be something that conflicted with Carpen's story. And for that, I had to be sure the story was complete. "You said McCann had gone out to paint the X," I said. "Did he paint it?" Carpen shook his head. He never got a chance. He spent all his time dancing, up till he went and killed himself. "So you painted it yourself?" He nodded. "And then you went on into Atronic City and registered your claim? Is that the story?" Number Chemisant City was closer than Atronic City right then, so I went there. Just after Jafe's death and everything. I didn't feel like being alone any more than I had to. "You said Chemisant City was closer to you then," I said. "Isn't it now?" "Things move around a lot out here, mister," he said. "Right now, Chemisant City's almost twice as far from here as Atronic City. In about 3 days it'll start swinging in closer again. Things keep shifting around out here." "So I've noticed," I said. "When you took off to go to Chemisant City, didn't you make a try for your partner's body then?" He shook his head. "He was long out of sight by then," he said. "That was 10, 11 hours later when I took off." "Why's that? All you had to do was paint the X and take off." "Mister, I told you I was drunk. I was falling down drunk. And when I saw I couldn't get at Jafe and he was dead anyway, I came back in here and slept it off. Maybe if I'd been sober, I would have taken the scooter and gone after him. But I was drunk." "I see. And there just weren't any more questions I could think of to ask. Not right now. So I said, I've just had a shaky 4-hour ride coming out here. Mind if I stick around a while before going back?" "Help yourself," he said, in a pretty poor attempt at genial hospitality. "You can sleep over if you want." "Fine," I said. "I think I'd like that." "You wouldn't happen to play cribbage, would you?" he asked, with the first real sign of animation I'd seen in him yet. "I learn fast," I told him. "Okay," he said. "I'll teach you." And he produced a filthy deck of cards and taught me. After losing 9 straight games of cribbage, I quit and got to my feet. I was at my most casual as I stretched and said, "Okay if I wander around outside for a while?" I've never been on an asteroid like this before. I mean, a little one like this. I've just been to the company cities up to now. "Go right ahead," he said. "I've got some polishing and patching to do anyway." He made his voice sound easy and innocent, but I noticed his eyes were alert and wary, watching me as I struggled back into my suit. I didn't bother to put my shirt back on first, and that was a mistake. The temperature inside an atmosphere suit is a steady 68 degrees. That had never seemed particularly chilly before, but after the heat of that dome, it seemed cold as a blizzard inside the suit. I went on out through the airlock and moved as briskly as possible in the cumbersome suit, while the sweat chilled on my back and face, and I accepted the glum conviction that one thing I was going to get out of this trip for sure was a nasty head cold. I went over to the X first and stood looking at it. It was just an X, that's all, shakily scrawled in yellow paint, with the initials J.A. scrawled much smaller beside it. I left the X and clumped away. The horizon was practically at arm's length, so it didn't take long for the dome to be out of sight. And then I clumped more slowly, studying the surface of the asteroid. What I was looking for was a grave. I believed that Carpen was lying, that he had murdered his partner, and I didn't believe that Jafe McCann's body had floated off into space. I was convinced that his body was still somewhere on this asteroid. Carpen had been forced to concoct a story about the body being lost because the appearance of the body would prove somehow that it had been murder and not accident. I was convinced of that, and now All I had to do was prove it. But that asteroid was a pretty unlikely place for a grave. That wasn't dirt I was walking on. It was rock, solid metallic rock. You don't dig a grave in solid rock, not with a shovel. You maybe can do it with dynamite, but that won't work too well if your object is to keep anybody from seeing that the hole has been made. Dirt can be patted down. Blown up rock looks like blown up rock, and that's all there is to it. I considered crevices and fissures in the surface, some cranny large enough for Carpin to have stuffed the body into. But I didn't find any of these either, as I plodded along, being sure to keep one magneted boot always in contact with the ground. Carpin and McCann had set their dome up at just about the only really level spot on that entire planetoid. The rest of it was nothing but jagged rock, and it wasn't easy traveling at all, maneuvering around with magnets on my boots and a bulky atmosphere suit cramping my movements. And then I stopped and looked out at space and cursed myself for a ring-tailed baboon. McCann's body might be anywhere in the solar system, anywhere at all, but there was one place I could be sure it wasn't, and that place was this asteroid. No, Carpin had not blown a grave or stuffed the body into a fissure in the ground. Why not? Because this chunk of rock was valuable, that's why not. Because Carpin was in the process of selling it to one of the major companies, and that company would come along and chop this chunk of rock to pieces, getting the valuable metal out, and McCann's body would turn up in the first week of operations if Carpin were stupid enough to bury it here. 10 hours between McCann's death and Carpin's departure for Chemisant City. He'd admitted that already, and I was willing to bet he'd spent at least part of that time carrying McCann's body to some other asteroid, one he was sure was nothing but worthless rock. If that were true, it meant the mortal remains of Jafe McCann were now somewhere, anywhere, in the asteroid belt. Even if I assumed that the body had been hidden on an asteroid somewhere between here and Chemisant City, which wasn't necessarily so, that wouldn't help at all. The relative positions of planetoids in the belt just keep on shifting. A small chunk of rock that was between here and Chemisant City a few weeks ago, it could be almost anywhere in the belt right now. The body, that was the main item. I'd more or less counted on finding it somehow. At the moment, I couldn't think of any other angle for attacking Carpin's story. As I clopped morosely back to the dome, I nibbled at Carpin's story in my mind. For instance, why go to Chemisant City? It was closer, he said, but it couldn't have been closer by more than a couple of hours. The way I understood it, Carpin was well known back on Atronic City. It was the normal base of operations for he and his partner, and he didn't know a soul at Chemisant City. Did it make sense for him to go somewhere he wasn't known after his partner's death, even if it was an hour closer? No, it made a lot more sense for a man in that situation to go where he's known, go someplace where he has friends who'll sympathize with him and help him over the shock of losing a partner of 15 years standing, even if going there does mean traveling an hour longer. And there was always the cash return form. That was what I was here about in the first place. It just didn't make sense for McCann to have held up his celebration while he filled out a form that he wouldn't be able to mail until he got back to Atronic City. And yet the company's handwriting experts were convinced that it wasn't a forgery, and I could pretty well take their word for it. Mulling these things over as I tramped back toward the dome, I suddenly heard a distant bell ringing way back in my head, the glimmering of an idea, not an idea yet, but just the hint of one. I wasn't sure where it led, or even if it led anywhere at all, but I was going to find out. Carpin opened the doors for me. By the time I'd stripped off the suit, he was back to work. He was cleaning the single unit which was his combination stove and refrigerator and sink and garbage disposal. I looked around the dome again, and I had to admit that a lot of ingenuity had gone into the manufacture and design of this dome and its contents. The dome itself, when deflated, folded down into an oblong box 3 feet by 1 foot by 1 foot. The lock itself, of course, folded separately into another box somewhat smaller than that. As for the gear inside the dome, it was functional and collapsible, and there wasn't a single item there that wasn't needed. There were the 2 chairs and the 2 cots and the table, all of them fold away. There was that fantastic combination job Carpen was cleaning right now, and that had dimensions of 4 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. The clutter of gear over to the left wasn't as much of a clutter as it looked. There was a Geiger counter, an automatic spectrograph, 2 atmosphere suits, a torsion densimeter, a core cutting drill, a few small hammers and picks, 2 spare air tanks, boxes of food concentrate, a paint tube, a doorless Jimmy John, and 2 small metal boxes about 8 inches cube. These last were undoubtedly Carpen's and McCann's pouches, where they kept whatever letters, money, address books, or other small bits of possessions they owned. Back of this mound of gear, against the wall, stood the air reconditioner, humming quietly to itself. In this small enclosed space there was everything a man needed to keep himself alive. Everything except human company. And if you didn't need human company, then you had everything. Just on the other side of that dome, there was 1,000,000 miles of death in 1,000,000 possible ways. On this side of the dome, life was cozy, if somewhat Spartan, and very hot. I knew for sure I was going to get a head cold. My body had adjusted to the 68 degrees inside the suit finally, and now was very annoyed to find the temperature shooting up to 90 again. Since Carpen didn't seem inclined to talk, and I would rather spend my time thinking than talking anyway, I took a hint from him and did some cleaning. I'd noticed a smeared spot about nose level on the faceplate of my fishbowl, and now was as good a time as any to get rid of it. It had a tendency to make my eyes cross. My shirt was sodden and wrinkled by this time anyway, having first been used to wipe sweat from my face, and later been rolled into a ball and left on the chair when I went outside, so I used it for a cleaning rag, buffing like mad the silvered surface of the faceplate. Faceplates are silvered, not so the man inside can look out and no one else can look in, but in order to keep some of the more violent rays of the sun from getting through to the face. I buffed for a while, and then I put the fishbowl on my head and looked through it. The spot was gone, so I went over and reattached it to the rest of the suit, and then settled back in my chair again and lit a cigarette. Carpen spoke up. "Wish you wouldn't smoke. Makes it tough on the conditioner." "Oh," I said, "sorry." So I just sat, thinking morosely about non-forged cash return forms and coincidences and likely spots to hide a body in the asteroid belt. Where would one dispose of a body in the asteroids? I went back through my thinking on that topic, and I found holes big enough to drive Carpen's claim through. This idea of leaving the body on some worthless chunk of rock, for instance. If Carpen had killed his partner, and I was dead sure he had, he'd planned it carefully, and he wouldn't be leaving anything to chance. Now, an asteroid isn't worthless to a prospector until that prospector has landed on it and tested it. Carpen might know that such and such an asteroid was nothing but worthless stone, but the guy who stops there and finds McCann's body might not know it. No, Carpen wouldn't leave that to chance. He would get rid of that body, and he would do it in such a way that nobody would ever find it. How? Not by leaving it on a worthless asteroid, and not by just pushing it off into space. The distance between asteroids is large, but so's the travel. McCann's body, floating around in the blackness, might just be found by somebody, and that, so far as I could see, eliminated the possibilities. McCann's body was in the belt. I'd eliminated both the asteroids themselves and the space around the asteroids as hiding places. What was left? The sun, of course. I thought that over for a while, rather surprised at myself for having noticed the possibility. Now, let's say Carpen attaches a small rocket to McCann's body, stuffed into its atmosphere suit. He sets the rocket going, and off goes McCann. Not that he aims it toward the sun, that wouldn't work well at all. Instead of falling into the sun, the body would simply take up a long elliptical orbit around the sun and would come back to the asteroids every few hundred years. No, he would aim McCann back, in the direction opposite to the direction or rotation of the asteroids. He would, in essence, slow McCann's body down, make it practically stop in relation to the motion of the asteroids, and then it would simply fall into the sun. None of my ideas, it seemed, were happy ones. If McCann's body were even at this moment falling toward the sun, it was just as useful to me as if it were on some other asteroid. But wait a second. Carpin and McCann had worked with the minimum of equipment. I'd already noticed that. They didn't have extras of anything, and they certainly wouldn't have extra rockets. Except for one fast trip to Chemisant City, when he had neither the time nor the excuse to buy a Jito rocket, Carpin had spent all of his time since McCann's death right here on this planetoid. So that killed that idea. While I was hunting around for some other idea, Carpin spoke up again for the first time in maybe 20 minutes. "You think I killed him, don't you?" he said, not looking around from his cleaning job. I considered my answer. There was no reason at all to be overly polite to this sour old buzzard, but at the same time I am naturally the soft-spoken type. "We aren't sure," I said. "We just think there are some odd items to be explained." "Such as what?" he demanded. "Such as the timing of McCann's cash return form." "I already explained that," he said. "I know. You've explained everything." "He wrote it out himself," the old man insisted. He put down his cleaning cloth and turned to face me. "I suppose your company checked the handwriting already, and Jafe McCann is the one who wrote that form." He was so blasted sure of himself. "It would seem that way," I said. "What other odd items you worried about?" he asked me, in a rusty attempt at sarcasm. "Well," I said, "there's this business of going to Chemisant City. It would have made more sense for you to go to Atronic City, where you were known." "Chemisant was closer," he said. He shook a finger at me. "That company of yours thinks it can cheat me out of my money," he said. "Well, it can't. I know my rights. That money belongs to me." "I guess you're doing pretty well without McCann," I said. His angry expression was replaced by one of bewilderment. "What do you mean?" "They told me back at Atronic City," I explained, "that McCann was the money expert, and you were the metals expert, and that's why McCann handled all your buying on credit and stuff like that. Looks as though you've got a pretty keen eye for money yourself." "I know what's mine," he mumbled, and turned away. He went back to scrubbing the stove coils again. I stared at his back. Something had happened just then, and I wasn't sure what. He'd just been starting to warm up to a tirade against the dirty insurance company, and all of a sudden he'd folded up and shut up like a clam. And then I saw it, or at least I saw part of it. I saw how that cash return form fit in, and how it made perfect sense. Now, all I needed was proof of murder, preferably a body. I had the rest of it. Then I could pack the old geezer back to Atronic City and get proof for the part I'd already figured out. I'd like that. I'd like getting back to Atronic City and having this all straightened out, and then taking the very next liner straight back to Earth. More immediately, I'd like getting out of this heat and back into the cool 68 degrees of... And then it hit me. The whole thing hit me, and I just sat there and stared. They did not carry extras, Carpin and McCann. They did not carry one item of equipment more than they needed. I sat there and looked at the place where the dead body was hidden, and I said, "Well, I'll be a son of a gun." He turned and looked at me, and then he followed the direction of my gaze, and he saw what I was staring at, and he made a jump across the room at the revolver lying on the cot. That's what saved me. He moved too fast, jerked his muscles too hard, and went sailing up and over the cot and ricocheted off the dome wall. And that gave me plenty of time to get up from the chair, moving more cautiously than he had, and get my hands on the revolver before he could get himself squared away again. I straightened with the gun in my hand and looked into a face white with frustration and rage. "Okay, Mr. McCann," I said, "it's all over." He knew I had him, but he tried not to show it. "What are you talking about? McCann's dead." "Sure he is," I said. Jafe McCann was the money-minded part of the team. He was the one who signed for all the loans and all the equipment bought on credit. With this big strike in, Jafe McCann was the one who'd have to pay all that money. "You're babbling," he snapped, but the words were hollow. You weren't satisfied with half a loaf, I said. You should have been. Half a loaf is better than none. But you wanted every penny you could get your hands on, and you wanted to pay out just as little money as you possibly could. So when you killed Ab Carpin, you saw a way to kill your debts as well. You'd become Ab Carpin, and it would be Jafe McCann who was dead, and the debts dead with him. That's a lie, he said, his voice getting shrill. I'm Ab Carpin, and I've got papers to prove it. Sure, papers you stole from a dead man, and you might have gotten away with it too. But you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Not satisfied with having the whole claim to yourself, you switched identities with your victim to avoid your debts. And not satisfied with that, you filled out a cash return form and tried to collect your money as your own heir. That's why you had to go to Chemisant City, where nobody would recognize Ab Carpin or Jafe McCann, rather than to Atronic City, where you were well known. You don't want to make too many wild accusations, he shouted, his voice shaking. You don't want to go around accusing people of things you can't prove. I can prove it, I told him. I can prove everything I've said. As to who you are, there's no problem. All I have to do is bring you back to Atronic City. There'll be plenty of people there to identify you. And as to proving you murdered Ab Carpin, I think his body will be proof enough, don't you? McCann watched me as I backed slowly around the room to the mound of gear. The partners had had no extra equipment at all. I looked down at the 2 atmosphere suits lying side by side on the metallic rock floor. 2 atmosphere suits. The dead man was supposed to be in one of those, floating out in space somewhere. He was in the suit, right enough, I was sure of that, but he wasn't floating anywhere. A spacesuit is a perfect place to hide a body for as long as it has to be hid. The silvered faceplate keeps you from seeing inside, and the suit is, naturally, a sealed atmosphere. A body can rot away to ashes inside a spacesuit, and you'll never notice a thing on the outside. I'd had the right idea after all. McCann had planned to get rid of Carpin's body by attaching a rocket to it, slowing it down, and letting it fall into the sun. But he hadn't had an opportunity yet to go buy a rocket. He couldn't go to Atronic City, where he could have bought the rocket on credit, and he couldn't go to Chemisant City until the claim sale went through, and he had some money to spend. And in the meantime, Carpin's body was perfectly safe, sealed away inside his atmosphere suit. And it would have been safe, too, if McCann hadn't been just a little bit too greedy. He could kill his partner and get away with it. Policemen on the belt are even farther apart than the asteroids. He could swindle his creditors and get away with it. They had no way of checking up and no reason to suspect a switch in identities. But when he tried to get his own money back from Tangier's Mutual Insurance, that's when he made his mistake. I studied the 2 atmosphere suits, at the same time managing to keep a wary eye on Jafe McCann, standing rigid and silent across the room. Which one of those suits contained the body of Ab Carpin? The one with the new patch on the chest, of course. As I'd guessed, McCann had shot him, and that's why he had the problem of disposing of the body in the first place. I prodded that suit with my toe. He's in there, isn't he? You're crazy. Think I should open it up and check? It's been almost a month, you know. I imagine he's pretty ripe by now. I reached down to the neck fastenings on the fishbowl, and McCann finally moved. His arms jerked up, and he cried, "Don't! He's in there! He's in there! For God's sake, don't open it up!" I relaxed. Mission accomplished. "Crawl into your suit, little man," I said. "We've got ourselves a trip to make, the 3 of us." Henderson, as usual, was jovial but stern. "You did a fine job up there, Ged," he said with false familiarity. "Really brilliant work." "Thank you very much," I said. I was holding the last piece of news for a minute or two, relishing it. "But you brought McCann in over a week ago. I don't see why you had to stay up at Atronic City at all after that, much less 10 days. I sat back in the chair and negligently crossed my legs. "I just thought I'd take a little vacation," I said carelessly, and lit a cigarette. I flicked ashes in the general direction of the ashtray on Henderson's desk. Some of them made it. "A vacation?" he echoed, eyes widening. Henderson was a company man, a real company man. A vacation for him was purgatory. It was separation from a loved one. "I don't believe you have a vacation coming," he said frostily, "for at least 6 months." "That's what you think, Henny," I said. All he could do at that was blink. I went on, enjoying myself hugely. "I don't like this company," I said, "and I don't like this job, and I don't like you, and from now on I've decided it's going to be vacation all the time." "Ged," he said, his voice faint, "what's the matter with you? Don't you feel well?" "I feel well," I told him. "I feel fine. Now, I'll tell you why I spent an extra 10 days at Atronic City. McCann made and registered the big strike, right?" Henderson nodded blankly, apparently not trusting himself to speak. "Wrong," I said cheerfully. "McCann went to Chemisant City and filled out all the forms required for registering a claim. But every place he was supposed to sign his name, he wrote Ab Carpin instead. Jafe McCann never did make a legal registration of his claim." Henderson just looked fish-eyed. "So," I went on, "as soon as I turned McCann over to the law at Atronic City, I went and registered that claim myself, and then I waited around for 10 days until the company finished the paperwork involved in buying that claim from me, and then I came straight back here just to say goodbye to you. Wasn't that nice?" He didn't move. "Goodbye," I said. The end. Best Audiobooks for Free hopes that you have enjoyed this production of The Risk Profession by Donald E. Westlake. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content. Please look to our website at bestaudiobooksforfree.com for a complete list of our audiobooks.